Virginia, 1852. Rain lashed the blackened windows of Marlow Manor, each droplet striking like a hurried knock. The wind howled through the skeletal trees as if mourning something not yet lost. Inside, by the dim light of a flickering oil lamp, Rosamond Marlow screamed. Her labor was long, too long. The midwife, a woman with no name and eyes like shale, kept her hands steady though her lips trembled with unspoken warnings. The house, cloaked in the scent of lavender and old blood, creaked as if trying to hold its breath. Rosamond's husband had died weeks before, crushed beneath his carriage. No one had heard from her since. Only the midwife dared come when the letter arrived, sealed with wax and a single word: urgent. The first child came at 3:59 a.m., a boy with fists already clenched. The second, a girl, followed at 4:22, silent but breathing. And the third, another boy, arrived just as the clock struck 5, Mo. His cry pierced the hush like glass shattering in a cathedral. Rosamond opened her eyes once, reaching out as if trying to hold them all together with her final breath, but her strength failed her. She died before dawn. The midwife wrapped each infant in a different colored cloth, crimson, navy, and ivory. She stared at them for a long while, her face hollow with dread. Then, one by one, she whispered a name no one else would ever know. Finally, she rose, reached into her bag, and retrieved 3 sealed envelopes, each bearing the same symbol: a coiled serpent devouring its own tail. She lit a candle. The flame burned a sickly green. "They must never meet," she said aloud, as if the walls themselves needed to hear. "Or dawn will take them all." Before the sun touched the hills, the triplets were gone, each taken by a different rider waiting just beyond the manor's gates. They vanished into the fog-drenched hills, swallowed by distance, by time, by silence. No one spoke of them again, not in Virginia, not anywhere. Years passed. The manor stood, but no one lived in it. Villagers claimed to hear crying at sunrise, and children dared each other to touch the gates. No one stayed past midnight, and yet in the annals of local record there were no Marlow children, no obituary for Rosamond, no trace of the midwife. Only the storm was remembered, and the way dawn looked that morning, too bright, too still. It became legend. A whisper passed down from grandmother to child, a story to frighten the disobedient. "Don't go near Marlow Manor," they'd say. "The sun rises differently there." But in the far corners of the country, the children grew, separated by miles, language, and love, raised as strangers, each carrying a piece of a curse they did not understand, inherited in blood, sealed by breath. Their paths would not cross for decades, but dawn was patient, and it never forgets. Subscribe to the channel if you love chilling mysteries and historical tales. More untold truths await you. The frost clung stubbornly to the Kentucky soil, though the calendar had turned to March. Jonah stood barefoot on the porch of the farmhouse, his breath fogging the air. He hadn't slept. Not well, not truly, not since his 13th birthday, when the mirror in his bedroom cracked without reason just as the first light of dawn touched its frame. His adoptive parents were kind, but distant. They'd found him swaddled in crimson cloth on their doorstep one icy morning. No note, no explanation. They named him after a preacher they'd admired and raised him as best they could. But Jonah always knew he didn't belong. There were the dreams. Every few weeks they came like a fever, visions of vast halls and burning candles, of voices calling names that weren't his. The one that returned most often showed a cradle rocking slowly in a forgotten room, then shattering as sunlight crept across the floor. Always the mirror, always the dawn. By 17, he had hardened. He had grown tall and solemn, a boy with a man's silence. He left the farm and joined the Union Army under a false name. The war was nearly over, but he didn't care. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing silence. But silence never came. He saw death on the battlefield, yet it felt oddly familiar. He watched the sunrise over the fields of Shiloh and felt cold, colder than night. He wrapped his hands in cloth each morning, claiming frostbite, though no doctor ever found signs. Fellow soldiers called him Ghost, not for cowardice, but for the way he wandered the camps at night, always just out of reach, speaking to no one. After the war, Jonah drifted. He took odd jobs, slept in barns, moved from county to county like a leaf tossed between rivers. But the dreams never left. They grew louder. One morning in 1869, he woke in a boarding house in western Tennessee, bathed in sweat. He had dreamed of 3 doors, each bearing a color: crimson, navy, ivory. One had opened. Inside stood a boy with his face. He didn't speak of it. He kept a journal, though, pages filled with crude sketches of houses he'd never seen and names he couldn't place. One page he returned to often, a drawing of a mirror split through the center, reflecting only light. It was the day after this dream that the letter arrived. He found it slipped beneath his door. The envelope was aged, the paper nearly brittle, no return address, only a seal pressed into the wax, a serpent curled into itself, the Ouroboros. Inside, a single line written in a delicate, slanted hand: "Come to Virginia. The dawn is waiting. No name, no directions." But Jonah knew. He left the next morning, leaving his few belongings behind. He took only the journal and the envelope, tucked into the inside of his coat. As he walked east, the early morning air pressed against his skin like ice, but this time it didn't bother him. He didn't know why he was going. He told himself he didn't care, but deep down, beneath layers of silence and cold, a part of him whispered a truth he'd never dared to face. He wasn't alone, and something was calling. In the distance, the sky lightened with the faintest touch of dawn. The rain in New Orleans had a rhythm of its own, like a half-forgotten waltz. Eloise sat at the grand piano in the Belvoir parlor, her fingers hovering above the keys, unmoving. Her hair clung to her neck, damp from the thick morning air. Outside, gas lamps flickered along Bourbon Street. Inside, time had stopped. She struck the first note. It echoed like a sigh. Music was her only language. Raised by the Dubois family, French Creoles with wealth and secrets in equal measure, Eloise had been discovered as a child prodigy. Found swaddled in navy cloth on the chapel steps after a hurricane, the Dubois matriarch called her a gift from the storm. They never sought her origins. She played by ear, effortlessly, but she never read music, not truly. Notes came to her in dreams, in colors, in feelings. And lately, always at dawn, she heard melodies she could not explain. The same progression, over and over. Minor chords, unresolved. A motif that began as a whisper and swelled into something mournful. The first time she played it aloud, Madame Dubois wept, but couldn't say why. Each morning, Eloise woke moments before sunlight touched her curtains. Her ears rang, her vision blurred. The light hurt, mirrors fogged for no reason, even when the air was dry, and always the song waited. In the early days, her tutors called her condition nerves, later sensitivity, but no diagnosis ever held. Eloise learned to pretend. In salons and parlors, she dazzled. She wore white gloves and smiled on command. But when she was alone, she played the strange song again and again, until the light made her sick. By 1883, her fame had grown. Invitations arrived from as far as Boston and Vienna. Yet she remained in New Orleans, bound by something unnamed. She felt it strongest near the river at sunrise when the fog rolled in and muffled the world. That spring, an unusual letter arrived. It bore no return address. The seal was a serpent devouring its own tail, elegant, precise, unfamiliar. Inside, a simple message, handwritten in a hand, both fluid and sharp. There is a melody waiting in Virginia. You are not the only one who hears it. She read it once, then again. Her hands trembled. That night, she dreamed of a piano unlike any she'd touched, covered in dust, set in a room with peeling wallpaper and a broken window. Someone sat beside her, though she couldn't see their face. They played the same strange song. And when dawn touched the keys, the piano cracked down the center. She woke screaming. The Dubois family insisted she see a doctor. She refused. She spent days in silence, walking along the levee, watching the water carry whispers from other lands. The letter burned in her pocket. The melody swirled in her chest. Eloise decided. She accepted an invitation to perform in Richmond. It was close enough. Close to the edge of something she could feel but not name. She packed lightly, one trunk, her ivory gloves, her journal filled with phrases like navy light and mirror in pieces. She told no one why she chose Virginia. Not truly. They thought it was opportunity. She let them believe it. But deep down, Eloise knew. There were things music could explain that words never could. She boarded the train on a Monday, wearing a blue dress the exact shade of the cloth she'd been found in. As the whistle blew and the wheels turned, she pressed her forehead to the glass. In the distance, the first pink edge of dawn crept over the horizon, and in her mind, the melody began again. Snow flurried along the cobbled streets of Philadelphia as Thomas leaned against the iron gate of the Quaker school, watching the flakes vanish on contact with his coat. He'd always felt removed from weather, as if the world never quite touched him the same way it touched others. A child born to silence, he seldom spoke unless prompted, but when he did, his words were sharp, calculated, deliberate. He'd been left as a newborn on the steps of the Friends' meeting house, wrapped in soft ivory cloth, with a single brass button tied into the folds. No name, no note. The Quakers took him in, naming him Thomas, after the disciple who doubted. By 10 he was fluent in Latin. By 15 he could recite entire pages of Gibbon and Pliny from memory. His mind devoured history like a starving wolf. He wasn't interested in the world as it was, only in what it had been lost, buried, or hidden. But even as he consumed facts and texts, there remained a void. Each year on his birthday, always before dawn, he would wake from the same dream, standing in front of an old wooden mirror, his reflection shifting, always unfamiliar. Behind him, a woman wept in silence. He never turned to see her face. He kept journals filled with symbols and sketches, among them a recurring motif, a serpent biting its own tail. It haunted him. He once found it in the margin of an obscure volume on Eastern mythologies, but no one could explain why it felt so familiar. In 1891, while sorting through a private donation at the Library of the Historical Society, Thomas stumbled across a faded family register from Virginia. One entry chilled him. Jonah Marlow, born 1852, presumed dead. No death date, no records, just a name. Beneath it, a hand-drawn image of a young man. Thomas stared. The face could have been his own. He took the page home, pressing it between his notebooks. Over the next weeks, he searched obsessively for more on the Marlows, but found little. The family had apparently faded into obscurity after the mid-century, and their estate, Marlow Manor, had long since been abandoned. Yet still he found whispers, mentions of strange births, a mother who died in childbirth. And always the same eerie phrase, they must never meet. He told himself it was coincidence, a trick of imagination. Yet he couldn't let it go. Something ancient pressed against the edges of his mind, as if history itself was reaching for him. One morning in November, before sunrise, he opened a worn collection of folklore and found a small envelope tucked between the pages. It hadn't been there before. No one had borrowed the volume in over a decade. The paper was yellowed, the seal brittle. The symbol was the same, the Ouroboros. Inside, a single line. Your reflection is incomplete. The rest waits in Virginia. Thomas's hands shook. He sat alone in the candlelit room, dawn just beginning to bloom behind the frost-lined window. He stared at his reflection in the glass pane. For a heartbeat, it flickered. He packed the next day quietly. He told the school he was researching a lost manuscript in Richmond. It wasn't a lie. Not entirely. He left behind only a letter for his mentor. There are truths older than books. Some must be faced, not read. As the train pulled away from the station, Thomas did not look back. He opened his journal and drew the mirror again. This time he split it down the middle. Somewhere he felt someone else had drawn the same thing, and they were waiting. The wind across the Blue Ridge carried a taste of copper that spring, heavy and strange. Trees bloomed in silence, their petals falling without sound as if the land itself was holding its breath. Jonah, now weathered and lean, walked alone along a dirt road that curved like a question through the foothills. He'd aged without noticing. The years had carved him hollow. He spoke to no one, slept little, and carried with him only a threadbare coat, a battered journal, and the envelope with the Ouroboros seal now soft with wear. Each morning, as dawn approached, he would pause, always at the same time, 5:59, and listen. For what, he couldn't say. But something lingered on the edge of hearing, just beyond the wind. He followed no map, just a feeling, a gravity pulling him east. Hundreds of miles away, Eloise leaned against the window of her railcar, watching the Virginia countryside unfold in muted green. Her fingers moved absently over the lace trim of her sleeve, tracing invisible notes. The melody hummed beneath her breath, but she didn't know she was singing. Her concert in Richmond had gone beautifully, though she didn't remember playing. What remained was the silence afterward, the way the audience sat frozen for several seconds before applauding. As if they had returned from some place they couldn't name. She hadn't slept since. The dreams had returned stronger. A house in the mountains, a boy with her face, a mirror that didn't reflect. In her coat pocket rested the letter. She read it each day, expecting the ink to fade or the paper to crumble. It never did. She felt watched, but not threatened. More like observed, by something waiting to see what choice she would make. She got off in a town she didn't know the name of, feet moving ahead of thought. People stared but said nothing. She followed a dirt path past the edge of civilization, where grass grew tall and fences bent from age. Somewhere, she believed, the house existed. She would know it when she saw it. Thomas, meanwhile, arrived in Charlottesville by carriage, his mind humming with questions. He carried books, loose pages of genealogies, maps. But nothing pointed directly to Marlow Manor. No one knew of it. When he asked in town, people looked away. That didn't surprise him. He found the symbol etched into a well-stone behind a church, small but precise. The serpent. It confirmed what he feared. The Ouroboros wasn't just a symbol. It was a thread looping through generations, always returning. That night, he sat in the boarding house, candles flickering, the letter unfolded on the desk. The ink had smudged slightly from his hands, though he hadn't touched it with moisture. The rest waits in Virginia. He didn't believe in fate, but he believed in patterns. And this one was too precise to dismiss. That week, all three reached within miles of each other. They didn't meet, but something stirred. Jonah passed a girl with gloved hands and navy eyes in the market. Their shoulders brushed. They didn't speak, but both turned almost simultaneously, then stopped, unsure why. Eloise lingered at the churchyard gate where Thomas had stood hours earlier, her fingers grazing the stone where the serpent had been carved. She felt a vibration in her bones, low and constant, like a tuning fork struck in the dark. Thomas woke the next morning with blood on his palm and no memory of how it got there. His journal now contained 3 new pages he didn't recall writing. Each bore a face. Each face looked like his. None of them were. As the sun broke over the hills, the light felt different, denser, the kind that doesn't warm, only reveals. And somewhere, deeper still, the loop began to tighten. Marlow Manor had no official place on any current map. Time had erased its borders, its ownership, its very name. Locals referred to it only as the house past the pines, if they referred to it at all. What remained of the road was swallowed by roots and silence. Trees leaned inward, as though conspiring to hide the path. Jonah arrived first. He stood before the rusted iron gate, the chain broken, the hinges swollen with rust. Vines curled around stone columns like hands trying to reclaim the earth. The manor loomed beyond, a crooked silhouette against the rising fog, its windows blind, its roof sagging under the weight of memory. He didn't knock. He simply stepped through. Inside, dust floated like ash. The wallpaper peeled in great strips, revealing a deeper layer beneath, faded patterns of serpents and flowers. Jonah felt dizzy, not from smell or decay, but recognition. He'd never been there. Yet every hallway felt like a place remembered in dream. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step releasing a groan. At the top, he passed a room with a broken cradle, He didn't enter. He walked until he found a room with no mirrors. There, he sat. That afternoon, Eloise arrived. She didn't mean to. Her horse had stopped on its own at the edge of the forest. She followed the trees on foot, the letter clutched tight in her palm. Her dress caught on brambles, her gloves tore, but she didn't turn back. When she saw the manor, her breath caught. She knew it before she saw it. Inside, she heard nothing. No footsteps, no wind. Only a low hum in the floorboards, like an instrument tuned too low to hear, but too present to ignore. Her fingers itched. The melody rose again, clearer now. She followed it to a parlor where a rotted piano slumped against the far wall. The keys were cracked, some missing. She sat and pressed one. It sang, a single, perfect note, untouched by time. She kept playing. Above her, Jonah stirred. Miles away in a different part of town, Thomas arrived late. His carriage driver refused to take him past a certain point, muttering nonsense about dawn and cursed ground. Thomas paid double and walked the rest. He carried with him only his satchel and the letter, now folded and refolded to the point of tearing. The air grew thicker as he approached. The birds stopped singing. Even the trees seemed quieter, their leaves unmoving. When he reached the manor's clearing, he stood frozen for a moment. It was exactly as he had seen it in dreams. He crossed the threshold and felt the house exhale. Cold swept through his coat and stayed, like a presence brushing past. He moved slowly, taking note of every detail, portraits without names, doors that led nowhere, the smell of ash and lavender. He heard music, faint, a piano. He followed it. On the second floor he found a long hallway lined with mirrors, each one shattered down the center. Some lay on the floor, others hung crooked. In one he saw not his face, but another man's, older, wearier. Jonah. He stepped back. Below, Eloise played. Jonah listened, and the house, for the first time in 50 years, remembered itself. They were near each other now, so close. But not yet together. The sun fell lower, the air thickened, and upstairs Thomas paused outside a door carved with the Ouroboros. His hand hovered above the knob. Something waited. But not just inside. In the space between breath and silence, the night at Marlow Manor was too still. No crickets, no wind, no settling of wood. Only silence, stretched tight like a wire. Jonah lay on a faded divan in the upstairs study, staring at the ceiling. The room had no mirrors. He'd made certain of that. The only glass was a small, dust-streaked window that let in pale moonlight and framed the surrounding trees. They stood unmoving, like sentinels. He hadn't spoken since entering the house, but now a whisper touched the edge of his hearing. Not words, just the cadence of breath from somewhere near. He sat up slowly. Across the house, Eloise ran her fingers over the keys of the ruined piano. She wasn't playing anymore. The notes had faded mid-phrase, as if something had cut the melody short. She stared at the keys, unsure whether she had ever begun. The room felt altered. Behind her, a mirror hung above the hearth. It was whole. Too clean. She hadn't noticed it before, and when she looked into it, she didn't see herself. The woman in the glass wore her dress, mirrored her every movement, but her eyes were dark and her mouth didn't move. Then it smiled. Eloise stumbled back, her chair toppled. The mirror did not shatter. It absorbed light instead, like ink in water. Thomas stood outside the nursery door. He'd been staring at the Ouroboros carved into the wood for what felt like hours. He traced it once with his fingertip, then turned the handle and entered. The room was bare, save for a single cracked rocking chair and a standing mirror in the corner. The air was warmer here, filled with the scent of dried flowers and smoke. He approached the mirror cautiously. In its surface he saw himself, but younger, maybe 10, maybe 12. The boy's expression was not his own, it was blank, unreadable. Then the boy turned and walked away, disappearing into a corridor that wasn't in the room. Thomas's breath caught. He reached out, and for the briefest instant, the glass felt soft, like breath. Back in the study, Jonah had moved to the hallway. The house had begun to whisper in earnest. He couldn't understand the words, but they came in waves, urgent, low, almost like prayer. He passed a mirror nailed to the wall beside a door. Its surface was fractured into 1,000 hairline lines, yet held together like frozen lightning. As he looked into it, he saw Eloise, not where she was now, but standing behind him. He turned quickly. No one there. He stepped closer. Now the mirror showed Thomas walking away down a corridor that curved like a spiral. Then Jonah himself, sitting in a room he didn't recognize, weeping. The glass began to fog. He turned away, heart pounding. Eloise, now in the hallway, felt herself drawn forward by something more than curiosity. She followed the sound of footfalls, not her own. Mirrors lined the walls, each one reflecting fragments. Faces she didn't know but somehow feared. She passed one and saw a girl in a white crib reaching toward her. She turned, but there was no room, no crib, just wall. Thomas returned to the hallway and descended the stairs, his hands trembling. In the foyer he saw a single mirror hanging crooked near the baseboard. Its surface had been scraped, as if someone had tried to erase whatever had lived inside. And still, in the very center, the Ouroboros remained, faint but present. He bent down and saw, just for a moment, all three of them, standing together. Then the image blinked. Gone. Something was shifting. Threads pulled tighter. The mirrors were no longer reflecting. They were watching. Jonah, Eloise, and Thomas moved through separate paths within the house, but the walls remembered them. The air thickened, time bent, and behind every step, the mirrors waited. The house had grown quieter, but not in peace. It was the stillness of held breath, of a tide drawn back before a storm. Eloise wandered into the music room again, her steps soft, as if afraid to wake something. The piano had gone silent. Even pressing the keys yielded nothing, no resistance, no sound. Her fingers tingled. The mirror above the hearth now bore a crack, thin as a hairline, running straight through its center. She could feel it behind her without looking. She turned instead to the shelves that lined the walls, most empty, some warped by time. One shelf sat lower than the rest, as if sagging under weight long gone. She tapped it, hollow. A loose panel shifted beneath her hand. Behind it, wrapped in yellowed silk, was a leather-bound book, worn but intact. She opened it. The pages, though brittle, revealed no dust, no scent of age. It was a journal. The script inside was fluid and aching, as though each word cost its writer more than ink. A name stood out first, Rosamond Marlow. Eloise read aloud without knowing why. I was warned before their birth to never let them see each other, to never let them know. But I feel them already, connected in ways I cannot untangle. The midwife says the bloodline carries an echo older than name, older than breath. Eloise pressed her hand against the page. Her breath slowed. Beneath her palm she felt heat. Jonah entered then, drawn not by sound but by something else, gravity perhaps. Their eyes met for the first time. The world did not end, but something shifted. Neither spoke. Jonah stepped closer, drawn by the open book. His eyes scanned the page, then looked to Eloise. He didn't know her. And yet he did. They both reached for the book. From the doorway Thomas appeared. No footsteps, no sound, just presence. He had followed the mirrors down a corridor and found himself here, where his skin tingled and his thoughts felt not entirely his own. He froze. Two strangers stood before him, but they weren't strangers, not to the part of him that had dreamed of cradles and cracked mirrors, not to the ache in his chest that had no name. Eloise turned slowly. Jonah stared. Thomas stepped forward and the air shifted. The mirror above the hearth shrieked. It didn't shatter. It warped. The journal snapped shut, pages fluttering violently before freezing still. Eloise whispered, "We're not supposed to be here." Thomas nodded. Together. Jonah stepped back. His hands trembled. Suddenly, all three were bathed in golden light. Dawn. It had come earlier than expected. The air thinned, the walls moaned, and in that moment, none of them could move. The house seemed to reel, as though deciding what to do with them. Thomas gasped and dropped to one knee, clutching his chest. A sudden pressure clamped down on him, as though invisible fingers wrapped around his ribs. Jonah stepped forward, gripping his arm. "Don't touch the glass," he said, voice dry from disuse. Eloise looked to the journal, now glowing faintly. She opened it again, flipping to the final page. A single line, "At dawn, they must part, or all will end." She didn't need to speak it. They each knew. Something had been set in motion long before they were born, something their mother had tried to prevent, something the midwife had feared. The bloodline wasn't just cursed, it was entangled, not just in flesh but in time. If they stayed together at sunrise, the loop would close, and with it, them. The first rays crept across the window pane. The light was wrong, too bright, too dense. Jonah looked to the door. "We have to leave." Thomas rose shakily. "Separately." Eloise clutched the journal to her chest. "We can't undo this." "But maybe we can delay it." They scattered. The house exhaled, and the mirror cracked a little deeper. The night dragged itself into morning with aching slowness, as though the sun hesitated, uncertain if it was safe to rise. Jonah sat alone in the nursery. He had returned there instinctively, as though something inside him demanded it. The air was stale and close, heavy with the scent of old linen and burned wax. Moonlight filtered through the cracked window, casting pale lines across the floorboards. The cradle remained where he had seen it days ago, tucked into the corner, still swaying slightly. Though no wind moved in the room, he stared at it. His heartbeat slowed. The journal lay open in his lap, turned to a page with no ink, only an impression, as if someone had written there once, then removed the writing. When he rubbed his fingers over it, he felt warmth, a pulse. Jonah closed his eyes. In that moment he saw it all, not in sequence but in flood. His birth, the storm, the cold hands that lifted him from his mother's arms, the red cloth, the horse hooves on wet earth, the gate closing, a mirror breaking, a scream swallowed by morning. He opened his eyes. A mirror had appeared in the corner. He hadn't seen it when he entered. Its surface shimmered, as though underwater. He stood and walked toward it. His reflection met him, no older, no sadder, just still. He raised his hand. The reflection did not move. Instead, it looked past him. Jonah turned slowly. There in the cradle lay a child, newborn, silent, wrapped in crimson. He stepped forward. The air thickened. The floor trembled. He reached down and lifted the child. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't warm. It wasn't breathing. Jonah held the bundle to his chest. From somewhere distant, a melody began, a piano, soft, incomplete. He closed his eyes again, and the room brightened. Not with sunlight, but with memory. His knees buckled. As he fell, he saw himself, not as he was, but as he might have been, laughing in a field, shoulder to shoulder with others, none of them alone. A life unlived, sealed in a cradle that never rocked. He hit the floor gently, as if the house had caught him. The mirror did not shatter. It clouded. A breath passed across the surface, then faded. Eloise, several rooms away, stopped mid-step. She felt it, not like a sound, but a silence so deep it left her cold. She turned toward the nursery, heart pounding. But something told her not to go. She pressed her hand against the wall, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Jonah." Thomas, now outside the house, looked back just as the upper window of the nursery glowed faintly. Then, darkness. The sun crested the ridge. Light touched the roof of Marlow Manor, and inside Jonah's body lay still, his arms cradling emptiness. No blood, no wounds, no cause. Only dawn. Later, the room would be found locked from the inside, the mirror covered in condensation, and a red cloth folded neatly at the foot of the cradle. Eloise would keep it. Thomas would not speak of it. And the house once more would fall into silence. But the loop had tightened, and the watchers in the glass had taken their first. Eloise never returned to the manor. After Jonah's death, she vanished from Virginia without a word. No train tickets, no letters, just absence, as if the house had undone her voice. She fled to Europe, crossing the Atlantic under a false name. In Paris, she found work as a composer, using aliases and refusing interviews. Her performances became rare and strange. Those who heard her play swore her music bled through walls and left a ringing in the ears that lasted days. Some wept uncontrollably. Others left mid-performance, unable to explain why. She stopped performing at dawn, always. At night, she lit candles and copied the melody that haunted her, its shape never quite complete, always shifting, always missing something. She wrote in notebooks by hand until her fingers blistered. On every cover, she drew the same symbol, a serpent swallowing its tail. Each morning she burned the pages. Across the ocean, Thomas lived in motion. He could not stay still. Towns blurred past. He took work in universities, then left without notice. He lectured once on inherited trauma and folklore, and was nearly fired for suggesting that memory might skip generations in ways science hadn't yet caught. In truth, he was searching. He had kept the journal. Eloise had left it in his coat pocket without explanation. Inside, he discovered something new, a folded sheet hidden behind the back cover, a birth chart written in Latin dated 1852, 3 names, 1 erased, 3 circles around the same star. He spent years tracking the handwriting. It led him south, then west. In 1921, in a Louisiana town where the air smelled of salt and secrets, he found her, the last descendant of the midwife. She didn't speak. Couldn't, perhaps, but her eyes burned with knowledge, as though she saw the whole line stretching behind him like smoke. She gave him a small iron key and a candle of deep black wax. Then she placed a hand over his heart and whispered a name. Arlen. Thomas didn't understand, but he didn't ask questions anymore. Back in his rented room, he lit the candle. The flame burned blue. He dreamed of the manor, whole again, new and bright, filled with laughter, but at the center stood a mirror taller than the walls, and within it he saw his face aging backward. Eloise stood behind him, Jonah in the doorway, all 3 turning toward dawn. Then he woke. The mirror beside his bed had cracked down the center. He packed his things and returned east. But not to Marlow. Not yet. Time around him seemed to falter. He aged slower than others. Friends grew old, died, forgot. He remained half invisible, whispering to strangers in libraries and graveyards, leaving notes in books he would never see opened. One summer, he stayed in a boarding house in Georgia. The innkeeper's son, a boy of no more than 7, woke screaming every morning at exactly 6. When asked what he dreamed, the boy said, "The light knocks too hard." Thomas left the next day. He began to mark the mirrors in every room he stayed, first with wax, then with paint, then with salt. Some nights the marks were gone by morning. He returned to writing, but only in cipher, symbols, lines, constellations of ink. He believed truly that time could fold, that memory could anchor itself in places, that buildings could breathe and houses could hunger. He wasn't wrong. In 1925, a package arrived with no sender. Inside, a photograph of Marlow Manor. Its windows were open. Its front gate swung wide. On the back, one line, "We are not finished." Thomas stared at it until dawn. Then he lit the black candle again. And waited. By 1930, Eloise was no longer the woman the world remembered. Her hair had silvered at the temples. She wore gloves not for style, but to hide the tremor in her fingers. Her name no longer appeared on programs or marquees. In Paris, people whispered of her like a myth, a pianist who vanished mid-career, whose last concert left a dozen guests fainting and 1 deaf for 3 days. She lived in a quiet cottage near the coast of Brittany, surrounded by salt air and silence. But the dreams returned, stronger now. She heard the piano again, always before dawn. She saw Jonah's face behind every mirror, older, sadder, eyes full of something unfinished. Thomas appeared too, often standing in doorways, reaching but never speaking. One night the dreams changed. She stood in the nursery. The cradle rocked gently. The journal lay open on the floor. The melody echoed through the walls, but this time she wasn't playing it. A child was, small fingers, unseen face. When she woke, the house was cold. The mirror above her dressing table had cracked down the center. She knew. The house was calling. She resisted at first. She avoided clocks, covered every mirror. Burned old letters, but the loop had begun to tighten again and time no longer moved cleanly. Her reflection lagged. Her voice echoed back in languages she had never spoken. Then came the letter. No envelope. Just a page, folded once. It has to end where it began. Beneath the words, a sketch, a house, split by lightning. Marlow Manor. She packed that same day. She left no message. She boarded a steamship across the Atlantic, then a train through Virginia, then another, smaller train to nowhere in particular. The track stopped before the mountains. She walked the rest. Along the way, her thoughts didn't feel like her own. She remembered things she'd never lived, climbing apple trees, hearing sermons in a Kentucky church, reading books beside a Quaker hearth. Fragments of Jonah and Thomas drifted through her mind like fog. By the time she reached the edge of the forest, she wasn't sure where she ended, and they began. She followed the trail through the trees. The air grew heavy. Her breath came shallow. And then she saw it. Marlow Manor stood exactly as it had in her childhood dreams. Not ruined, not rotting, but whole. The paint fresh, the shutters firm. Smoke curled from the chimney. She stepped through the gate. The moment she did, the melody started, not in her ears, in the ground. It pulsed up through her shoes, through her ribs, into her chest. She crossed the porch and opened the door without knocking. Inside it smelled of lavender and burning wax. She walked through the foyer, passing the same shattered mirror she had once avoided. Now it was whole again. Her reflection stared back, still and silent, but did not blink when she did. She passed the music room. The piano stood open, waiting, but she did not enter. She climbed the stairs instead, following the hum in the floorboards. Her steps were slow, deliberate, measured. At the top, the nursery door was ajar. She pushed it open. The cradle was empty. But the red cloth lay folded neatly at its base. The journal rested on the rocking chair. She sat and waited. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Somewhere deep in the walls, a mirror exhaled. The house remembered her. And she finally remembered it. The hour before dawn was neither night nor morning. Inside the manor, time folded. Eloise sat in the nursery, the journal closed in her lap. The red cloth remained at her feet, untouched. She hadn't moved in hours. Her breath came slow, steady, but shallow. She stared at the wall opposite the crib, where once there had been peeling wallpaper and dust. Now it was clean. Now it was white. The mirror above the dresser had returned. It glowed faintly in the dimness. She rose without thought. Her legs ached. Her fingers tingled. As she stepped toward the glass, she could hear the melody again, not from the piano but from within her. The same unfinished tune, always looping, always returning to the same unresolved chord. She reached out. The glass shimmered. Her reflection blinked, slowly, deliberately. But its timing was wrong. It moved ahead of her, not behind. It smiled before she did. And in that smile she saw her brother, Jonah. Behind the reflection another form appeared, Thomas. And then a third, herself. 3 reflections, but none aligned, none synchronized. They watched her as if waiting. She touched the mirror. The moment her fingers met the surface, the melody stopped. No crescendo, no final note, only silence. And then, dawn. The first light spilled into the room like floodwater. The window flared, the mirror cracked, and Eloise fell. Downstairs, the parlor clock struck 6. Outside, a boy wandered through the trees behind the house, chasing a rabbit he'd seen dart into the brush. He stopped when he heard the shattering glass. He turned toward the house, wide-eyed, silent. From where he stood, he could see the upper window glowing gold, and in that light he saw a woman, arms raised, head tilted back, face calm. Then she vanished. The light faded. When he reached the back porch, no door opened, no voices called. But he noticed something strange. No birds sang, no wind moved the leaves. And when he peered inside through a dusty pane of glass, he saw only the outline of a grand mirror in the ballroom, its surface blackened like coal. He turned and ran. By the time anyone came, the house was empty. No body, no blood, no sign of forced entry. Only one thing remained, a pair of ivory gloves folded neatly on the piano bench. Over the next week, stories spread. Of a woman seen walking barefoot along the ridge, humming a lullaby in a language no one recognized. Of music heard in the wind, just before sunrise, soft, unfinished, vanishing with the light. An old historian noted the similarity to a record from 1752, a woman named Mirabel Marlow, who collapsed in her parlor at dawn, clutching a mirror that had never reflected her again. It was written off as coincidence, but in private those who remembered whispered, "It's starting again." Thomas read about Eloise's death in a newspaper clipped and mailed with no return address, no article, no name, just the obituary heading. A musician, a shadow, a morning gone. He read it twice, then he lit the black candle once more. The flame did not flicker. He placed the gloves beside Jonah's cloth and waited for the light. Thomas lived now in shadows. His house sat at the edge of a dying town in upstate New York, a place where winters arrived early and spring seldom stayed. He rarely ventured outside. Neighbors called him the Candle Man. For every night a strange light flickered through his windows long after the street lamps had dimmed. Inside, the walls were lined with clocks. None of them worked. They hung in uneven rows from floor to ceiling, each stuck at a different hour, most of them between 5 and 6. He didn't try to fix them, he only listened. At 5:59 each morning, one would chime. A single hollow note. He marked it in his ledger every day, along with drawings of serpents, keys, and stars. The journal was thick now, pages bound with thread, and sealed in places with wax. He no longer dreamed, but the house did. Sometimes Thomas heard voices coming from the mirrors he'd covered. Not words, just breath, as if someone waited patiently on the other side. He spoke aloud to the empty rooms, to Jonah, to Eloise, to Rosamond. To the midwife, whose name he never learned but whose whisper remained like a splinter in his mind. In 1944 he received a letter. It bore no stamp, no sender, no seal. Inside was a drawing, rough, childlike, a boy and girl standing beneath a tree, holding a red string between them. Behind them a house with no windows. Beneath it one word in slanted black ink, Arlen. Thomas didn't recognize the name, but the drawing felt familiar. It wasn't a message, it was a reminder. He left the next morning, traveling by train, then bus, then foot, through hills and forests where towns had withered away. He knocked on doors. He asked questions in libraries, churches, barbershops. No one had heard of Arlen. Until he reached a roadhouse near the Tennessee border, where a blind woman tending the counter paused mid-conversation and said, "You're looking for her, aren't you?" He didn't speak. She reached beneath the bar and retrieved a box, small, wooden, sealed with pitch. She handed it to him and said, "She's the last she remembers, but she can't speak. You'll find her in the hollow with no name." He opened the box in a motel that night. Inside, a single object, a candle, black wax, short wick, wrapped in a ribbon of ivory silk, the same kind Eloise had worn. Thomas traveled south through valleys and thick woods until 2 weeks later he reached the hollow. There was no road, no markers. Only trees that curved inward, blocking sunlight, muffling wind. At its center stood a cabin. Inside, an old woman sat in silence. Her eyes were milky with age, but her gaze held steady. On the table between them sat 3 items, a cracked mirror, a pocket watch, and a strip of faded red cloth. He said nothing. She took his hand and turned it palm up. Then, with a crooked finger, she traced a symbol on his skin, the Ouroboros, before placing the candle in his palm. Then she whispered one name, not Arlen, not Marlow, just return. Thomas nodded. He understood. The time had come to finish it. He returned home, placed the candle on the mantel, and waited for the hour. Each morning at 5:59 the clocks chimed. and the house listened. The next time it rang, he would follow the sound back to where it all began. Thomas was now an old man, his back bent slightly, his hands trembled when still for too long, but his eyes remained sharp, and his memory, though fragmented, held one thread tighter than the rest: return. In the winter of 1956, he packed a single suitcase. Inside, the journal, the candle wrapped in silk, the pocket watch from the cabin, and a shard of mirror he'd kept since Eloise's death. He told no one where he was going. There was no one left to tell. He arrived in Virginia under grey skies. The town that once whispered of Marlow Manor was nearly gone, stores closed, streets cracked, names forgotten. Only the mountains remained the same, quiet and waiting. He followed the old road, though much of it had been swallowed by roots and bramble. His legs ached with each step, but he did not slow. With every turn, the air thickened. The sky dimmed, though no clouds passed. When he reached the clearing, he stopped. Marlow Manor stood exactly as he remembered, unchanged by fire, untouched by time. It looked not like a ruin, but a memory made real. The paint was fresh. The windows glowed faintly. It had been waiting for him. He crossed the threshold and the house inhaled. The floorboards creaked in rhythm beneath him, as if guiding his steps. He made no effort to explore. He knew where to go: up the stairs, down the left corridor, through the final door on the right, the nursery. It was empty, but not dead. He placed the journal on the rocking chair, the shard of mirror on the windowsill, the watch on the cradle's edge. Then he lit the candle. The flame burned low and blue. The room pulsed. He felt it in his bones. The air grew warm, then heavy. Dust shifted across the floor. The walls seemed to stretch and contract like lungs drawing breath. Then the light changed. Soft at first, dawn's approach, but denser, more deliberate. The glow crept across the rug toward the cradle. Thomas closed his eyes. He whispered names: Jonah, Eloise, Rosamond. He whispered one more, his own. The flame flickered, and then the door behind him creaked. He turned. There they stood. Jonah, still young. Eloise, still poised. Not ghosts, not memories. Echoes suspended in a moment that refused to end. He did not speak. He stepped toward them, and they did not vanish. Instead, they watched as he reached the center of the room, lifted the candle, and placed it inside the cradle. The flame flared, blue to gold, then white. The room trembled, the mirror shard shattered. The pocket watch burst open, its hands spinning wild before stopping at 6 Gauss. Thomas fell to his knees. The house groaned, then silence. He looked up. The echoes were gone. No more visions, no more reflections, just stillness. He lay down beside the cradle. The candle burned steady, tall, unwavering. Outside, the first light of dawn crested the hill. Inside, Thomas exhaled, a final peaceful breath. The house did not collapse. It did not roar or break. It sighed, as though the loop had finally released, and waited for morning. By the time the sun had fully risen, the candle was gone. Only a trail of cooled wax remained on the cradle's edge, curled like dried tears. Thomas lay beside it, his expression calm, his hands folded over his chest. The light streamed across the floor, clean and warm. Nothing stirred. At exactly 6:01, every mirror in the house shattered, not in violence but in relief. Across Virginia, strange reports emerged. In a church attic, a forgotten-looking glass split down the middle. In a hotel hallway, guests woke to find every reflective surface blackened, unable to show their own faces. In a child's bedroom, a toy mirror cracked with no sound, and the girl simply smiled and said, "They're done now." Back at the manor, smoke began to curl from beneath the floorboards. Not fire, not heat, release. The wood did not burn. It softened. The walls buckled inward, not from collapse but exhalation, as if the house had held its breath for a century, and now, at last, could let go. By midday, Marlow Manor was no longer standing. In its place, a circle of scorched grass, soft and silent. At the center, a sprout of ivy pushed through the soil. No remains were found. No grave was dug. Only echoes lingered, faint and slow to fade, like the final note of a song long unfinished. The curse had not been broken. It had been fulfilled. The children had returned. The loop had closed. And with it, so had the hunger. Years later, those who lived near the ridge would sometimes hear music in the distance just before sunrise. Not full songs, just fragments. A few notes, then quiet, as if someone were remembering. In 1962, a woman hiking alone along the Blue Ridge came upon the clearing. She found nothing unusual, just open space and a peculiar warmth in the soil. That night she gave birth 2 weeks early to a perfectly healthy boy. She named him Arlen. She never knew why. She would never learn the stories. But her son never feared dawn. He slept soundly each morning, and no mirror in their home ever cracked. If you found this story haunting, mesmerizing, or unforgettable, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more tales that twist the boundaries of time, fate, and memory. And if you want to keep going down the rabbit hole, click the next video on your screen now. A new mystery is waiting, and dawn always comes.